If they see who I really am, they'll leave. That sentence, maybe it doesn't show up in those exact words for you. Maybe it's shorter, quieter. Sometimes it's just a feeling, a small tightening in your chest before you say something that actually matters, a second of hesitation before you send a message, a quick adjustment in what you were about to say, replaced by something safer, more vague, more acceptable. But underneath it all, the sentence is there. If they see who I really am, they'll leave. It doesn't arrive with force, it doesn't shout, it whispers. And the problem with whispers is that they're hard to question. What shouts you argue with, what whispers you obey. You obey it without even noticing. You stay a little quieter in the meeting than you needed to be. You laugh at something that actually irritated you, just to avoid friction. Someone asks how you're doing and you say, I'm good, even when you're not. You hold back an opinion before saying it, not because you changed your mind, but because, for a split second, you imagined what people might think. Your body feels it before your mind turns it into words. A small drop in your stomach, heat rising in your neck. Your breathing shifts when someone seems less warm than you expected, when a conversation suddenly cools, when someone takes a long time to reply. When you walk into a room and somehow feel, without any real evidence, that maybe you're not that welcome there. You don't call this fear of being rejected. You call it being realistic. You call it understanding people. You call it not wanting to cause problems, but your body knows, and your body carries that weight all day. That sentence, if they really knew me, they'd leave, isn't a rational conclusion. It's older than that. It showed up long before you had the words for it. It was built during a time when exclusion wasn't just social discomfort. It felt like real danger, the kind of loneliness a child feels in their body before they can explain it, a kind of distance, a kind of abandonment, something a child can't name, but can feel with absolute clarity. And because it hurt so much, a part of you learned something simple. Better not risk it. Better show a little less. Better adjust a little more. Better be the version of yourself that seems easier to love. And for years, sometimes decades, that strategy worked, or at least it looked like it did. People stayed. No one left. You learned how to adjust quickly enough to keep everything stable. But there's a cost. Not a visible one, an invisible one. The constant effort of monitoring what you show and what you hide. The distance between the person people think they know and the person you are when you're alone. The strange loneliness of being surrounded by people and still feeling like no one really knows you. That loneliness doesn't come from a lack of connection. It comes from too much protection. In this video, we're going to look inside that sentence, not to erase it. It doesn't disappear just because you want it to, but to understand where it came from, how it was learned, and what begins to change when you start hearing that voice, without automatically obeying it. This isn't a quick process. It's not a 5-step list. It's slower than that. It's the kind of inner work that begins the moment you notice, that sentence lives inside me, and it's been running more of my life than I realized. From there, we start walking through it together. Jackson doesn't look like someone who's afraid of anything. 34 years old. His own apartment in a complex in Austin, Texas. The kind of place with a pool nobody really uses, a small gym on the ground floor, and neighbors who nod in the hallway but never learn each other's names. Paid off car, a stable job at a tech company where people are competent, polite, and too busy to ask how you're actually doing. From the outside, everything looks in place, but there's something Jackson does every day, many times a day, that he's never named. He edits himself. Before speaking, a quick filter runs. So fast it feels like instinct. Check if what he's about to say is safe. Check if it might land wrong. Check if it might create an impression he'll later have to manage. And if there's any doubt, he adjusts, softens it, holds it back, or just doesn't say it. He doesn't notice he's doing it. It's as automatic as blinking. Jackson goes to the gym 3 times a week, Monday, Wednesday, Friday. Always the same time, right after work, headphones on, a nod to the same familiar faces. He rarely starts conversations. Not because he's antisocial, but conversation asks for real presence, and real presence asks you to lower your guard, even for a moment. And lowering his guard, even somewhere as ordinary as a gym, touches something in him that would rather stay quiet. On Wednesdays, if he's low on energy, He orders food on DoorDash. He watches series he starts and sometimes never finishes, especially when they begin asking too much emotionally. Once in a while, he goes to a happy hour with co-workers. He has a beer, laughs at the right moments, joins the conversation just enough not to seem distant. Then he drives home with that vague feeling that maybe he should have said less somewhere along the way. He can't quite tell where. He's not shy. That's the confusing part. Jackson knows how to talk to people. He knows how to ask good questions. He knows how to make people feel comfortable. In fact, he's very good at it, but in the way you get good at something through practice, not because it came naturally. He learned early on that if you get people talking about themselves, you're safe. You don't have to reveal much. You control how much of you actually shows up in the conversation. This wasn't a conscious decision. It was an adaptation. The adaptations we learn in childhood don't arrive with warning signs. They arrive as personality, as "this is just how I am." Every Monday morning, Jackson has a product meeting. 8 people in a glass conference room, Starbucks coffee in their hands. Slides on a screen. He always arrives a few minutes early, straightens his notebook, sits near the wall, never at the head of the table. He listens, contributes when someone asks him directly. Sometimes he has an idea he knows is good, an angle nobody's mentioned yet, a detail everyone else missed. He waits for the right moment. Then another thought arrives. Will it land well? Will it sound like he's trying too hard to stand out? Will the manager think he's being difficult, or like he's the guy who always has something to say? And while he's thinking, someone else speaks. The moment is gone. He leaves meetings with the feeling that something important stayed inside him. He doesn't quite know how to name it. So he calls it "not the right moment," or "it wouldn't change anything anyway," or "I prefer to be sure before I speak." But on the drive home, on Highway 183 with the radio low and traffic barely moving, the weight shows up. Not as a clear thought, more like pressure in his chest, like something that's been stuck since 9 in the morning and only now found space to be felt. Sometimes he rubs his face at a red light and doesn't really know why. Have you ever left a conversation, a meeting, a moment with someone, and only later, alone in the car, realized how much you held back, how much more was inside you than what actually came out? If you have, you know that weight. With his girlfriend, Sarah, things are different, but they're also the same. They've been together almost 2 years. Sarah is direct. She has opinions about everything. She's not afraid of conflict. Jackson admires that about her with a sincerity that sometimes hurts, because he knows it's exactly what he struggles to be. Being with someone like that puts him in a constant state of quiet alertness. When she's having a hard day, he checks her tone before he speaks, reads the mood before sharing anything about his own day. He tries to sense whether this is a moment to be light or a moment to stay quiet. Sometimes he keeps things to himself for days, worries, frustrations, thoughts that show up late at night, because he doesn't want to add pressure. Because she already has enough going on, because it's not worth stirring things up. Those reasons sound reasonable. They sound considerate. They even sound like love. But underneath each one of them, if Jackson looked honestly, he'd find the same thing. The fear that showing too much might make her see something that pushes her away. There's one night he still remembers clearly. They were on the couch after dinner. Her shoes were off. She was leaning against him, scrolling through her phone. It was a good moment, the kind that feels easy, safe. And Sarah glanced at him and said casually, "You okay? You're quiet." Jackson said he was tired. Long day. It wasn't a lie, but it wasn't the real answer either. The real answer would have been something like this: "I've felt a little disconnected from myself the past few days, and I'm not sure why. Sometimes I sit here next to you and wonder if you really know me, or if you only know the version of me I let people see." But that answer felt too big, like it was asking for something he didn't even know how to name, like it might expose a version of him he wasn't sure she could hold without thinking something was fundamentally wrong with him. So he said he was tired. She believed him, went back to her phone. He stared at the ceiling. Later that night, when she fell asleep, he stayed awake another hour with that familiar feeling. The feeling of being close to someone and still completely alone. Not because she was distant, because he had pulled away first, in a way she didn't even know had happened. On weekends, with Tyler and Chris, his college friends, the closest ones he has, Jackson is more relaxed. They play tennis every Saturday when the weather is above 60 degrees. Afterward, they grab beers at a bar near the park. They talk about sports, work, movies, inside jokes that only make sense to the three of them. With them, he laughs more freely, spends less time in monitoring mode, but even there, even in the safest moments of his week, there's a waiting room inside him, a quiet space where certain things never enter, the insecurities that are never named, the fears that would feel too strange, too serious, too vulnerable for a Saturday afternoon of tennis and beer. Jackson doesn't know if Tyler or Chris have their own waiting rooms. They've never talked about it. Maybe they do. Maybe the whole friendship, solid and real as it is, lives partly inside that silent agreement not to go too far. Jackson wouldn't say he's unhappy. That's not the word he'd use. There are good days, real moments of lightness, a life that, by most objective measures, is working, but there's something draining him, quiet, constant, like background temperature. It's the ongoing effort of being an edited version of himself, everywhere, at work, with Sarah, with Tyler, and Chris. At Whole Foods on a Sunday afternoon, when someone bumps their cart into his, and he smiles and says, "No worries," even though he felt irritated. In every room, every conversation, every moment when part of him is calculating in real time how safe it is to appear. Something inside Jackson is always scanning the environment, measuring how safe it is to show himself. And the moment there's even a small signal that maybe it isn't, a shift in someone's tone, an unexpected pause, a look that feels slightly evaluative, a shorter reply than usual, the system activates. Quiet, precise, immediate, hide, adjust, apologize, change the subject, and underneath it all, the sentence keeps pulsing, sometimes as words, sometimes just as a feeling. If they see who I really am, they'll leave. Have you ever adjusted yourself in the middle of a conversation without really knowing why? Not because the situation required it, not because it was strategic, but because some part of you calculated in less than a second that the real version of you might be too risky? If that sounds familiar, stay here. We're going to the root of it. The alarm doesn't sound loud. That's the problem. If it were loud, Jackson would notice it. He might question it, maybe even argue with it. But the rejection alarm doesn't work like that. It works like room temperature. Always there, always influencing things, rarely noticed. It's a background state. Background states don't feel like thoughts. They feel like obvious decisions, like preferences that seem natural, like limits that seem reasonable. I just don't like creating drama. I'm just not the kind of person who talks about myself much. I just don't like depending on people. Just. That word is the alarm's favorite disguise. When you say, "That's just how I am," you're describing a learned pattern like it's an identity, like you were born with it, like there's nothing underneath it to examine. But there is. The alarm runs in a cycle, and it repeats with quiet precision. First, a trigger. Anything the system reads as possible exposure, a direct question, a pause in a conversation, a message that takes longer than expected to come back, a neutral expression when Jackson was hoping for a smile. The trigger doesn't have to be real. It only has to feel plausible. Second comes the interpretation. The system translates the trigger into evidence. She took longer to reply because she's losing interest. He went quiet because I talked too much. They ignored my idea because it wasn't worth much anyway. The interpretation arrives fast, with the confidence of someone who's seen this movie before, with the certainty of someone who thinks they know the ending. Third comes the response. Automatic protection, pull back, adjust, strategic silence, more kindness than necessary, less truth than would actually be healthy. And then the fourth moment, the most deceptive one, false confirmation. Because Jackson adjusted, the conversation keeps moving. Sarah doesn't leave. His co-workers don't exclude him. So the system records the result. It worked. It logs the adjustment as the reason people stayed, instead of considering that they might have stayed anyway. And the cycle closes. Stronger than before. But where did this system come from? It didn't appear out of nowhere. It's not a factory defect. It's a construction. A smart one, built by a much younger part of Jackson at a time when making sense of the world was necessary just to survive it emotionally. That part has a name. It's called the rejection reader. The rejection reader is the shadow that learned very early to scan faces, to measure silence, to estimate how much of yourself is safe to show depending on who's in the room. It's not malicious, it's not your enemy. It's a part of you that was trained in an environment where approval wasn't guaranteed, and where losing that approval hurt in a way a child isn't equipped to process alone. So it built a system. If I see it coming, I won't be caught off guard. If I adjust first, I won't have to be rejected later. If I show less, there's less to reject. That logic made sense. At some point in your story, it was necessary. Imagine a simple scene, not dramatic, just ordinary. Jackson is about 10 years old. He comes home from school excited about something. A good grade, an idea, some small detail from his day that felt important to him. He walks into the house and the emotional climate is wrong. Someone is irritated, or distant, or simply too tired to be present. His excitement meets a wall, not cruelty. Absence. And in that moment, he learns something. Timing matters. Other people's emotional state decides how much space he gets. His expression needs to be calibrated to the room, because when you show something real in the wrong emotional environment, it hurts. That pattern repeats. Different versions, different people, and the rejection reader gets more sophisticated faster, better at scanning. It expands the list of situations that might be dangerous. It refines the protection strategies, until one day, at 34 years old, Jackson walks into every room already in reading mode, without noticing, without choosing it. The shadow now has a name, and when something has a name, it loses some of its power. Not because naming it solves everything, but because when the rejection reader has no name, it operates as you, as your personality, as "that's just how I am." Once it has a name, something shifts. It stops being you and becomes a part of you, a part with a history, a part that was useful, a part that is still trying to protect you from a kind of pain that may not exist anymore the way it once did. But here's the central trap. The more Jackson tries to fight that voice, the louder the alarm becomes. The more he tries to convince himself that it isn't true, that people won't leave, that he has value, the more the system activates. Because trying to silence the alarm looks like confirmation that danger is real. If you need to convince yourself you're safe, some part of you must believe you're not. Arguing with the rejection reader using logic is like yelling at a smoke detector to stop beeping. The detector doesn't understand arguments. It understands the absence of threat. And the absence of threat isn't something you explain. It's something you experience slowly, through repetition, through time. The solution isn't to silence the voice. It's to learn how to hear it without automatically obeying it. And to do that, Jackson will need something the rejection reader never had the chance to develop, because it was too busy scanning the outside world for danger. He'll need an inner presence that can notice the alarm without being controlled by it. There is no version of Jackson without the rejection reader. It's important to say that before we go any further, because if you enter this process expecting the voice to disappear, expecting the alarm to shut off, expecting a day when the thought simply never shows up again, you'll end up frustrated. And that frustration will be read by the system as more evidence that something is wrong with you. The goal isn't elimination. The goal is internal distance. There's a big difference between being a thought and having a thought. When Jackson is fused with the rejection reader, the thought doesn't appear as something he observes. It appears as something he is, as reality, as a simple fact about the world. People leave when they really know you. In that moment, it doesn't feel like fear. It feels like truth. Internal distance is the moment when the thought appears, and Jackson notices that it appeared, that's all. For now, that's enough. That ability has a name. It's called the witness. The witness isn't a calmer personality. It isn't an enlightened version of Jackson that never feels afraid. It isn't the absence of anxiety. It's a function, a very specific capacity that can be trained. The capacity to observe what's happening inside you without immediately becoming it. The rejection reader reacts, the witness observes. The rejection reader reads silence as rejection. The witness notices, I'm interpreting that silence as rejection. Interesting. Is that a fact? Or is that my reading? The rejection reader adjusts Jackson's behavior before he even realizes it. The witness creates a millimeter of space between the trigger and the response. A millimeter, not a transformation, just a millimeter. But millimeters repeated over time change trajectories. Imagine an ordinary morning. Jackson is at work. He sends an email to his manager with a suggestion. It already took courage to send it. 2 hours pass, no reply. The rejection reader wakes up immediately. The narrative begins forming. He didn't like it. He's probably judging you now. You pushed too far. You should have stayed quiet. In earlier versions of this day, Jackson would spend the entire afternoon inside that story, checking his inbox, getting quieter in the next meeting, holding back his next idea for weeks. But when the witness is present, something slightly different happens. Nothing dramatic, nothing cinematic, something small. Jackson notices that he's building a story. He can't stop the story from appearing. It's already there, but for a brief moment, he can name what's happening. The rejection reader is active. It's reading 2 hours without a reply as rejection. Is that real, or is that a reading? He doesn't know the answer. Maybe the manager didn't like the idea. Maybe he did. But now there's a question where before there was only certainty. A question opens space. Certainty closes it. This process isn't linear. During the same week, Jackson might have a night with Sarah where the rejection reader runs at full speed and the witness doesn't show up in time. He adjusts before realizing he adjusted. He gives a safer answer before noticing there was a more honest one available. He goes to bed with that familiar sense of distance, even while lying right next to her. That's not failure. That's how the process works. The witness doesn't appear in every moment. It appears in some moments. And those moments teach Jackson something. They teach him what it feels like to notice the thought before obeying it. They teach him that the world doesn't collapse when he doesn't immediately adjust. They teach him that sometimes people stay even when he doesn't perform the adjustment. Each time that happens, the system records new information, not dramatically, quietly. In the same silent way, the alarm grew stronger over the years. Except now, the learning moves in the opposite direction. The most important moment isn't when Jackson does something brave. It's when he notices the urge to hide and manages to pause for 1 second before acting. No resolution. No motivational speech in his head, no attempt to convince himself he's safe. Just pause, notice. This is the rejection reader. It's reading this situation as dangerous. Maybe it's right, maybe it isn't, but this thought isn't a command. It's information, and I get to decide what I do with it. That second of pause, that millimeter of space between the trigger and the automatic response. That's where the witness lives. It's not a revelation, not a cure, just a pause. And a pause, repeated over time, becomes a little longer. A little more frequent, a little easier to find in the moments that matter most. That's where real freedom begins, not in the absence of fear, but in the ability to feel the fear and still choose. 30 days isn't enough time to change who you are, but it is enough time to begin changing your relationship with what you think. That distinction matters, because the goal of this practice isn't to make the rejection reader disappear. It isn't to wake up on day 30 without the fear of being left. It isn't to become someone who says everything on their mind, someone who speaks without hesitation, without care, without awareness of others. That's not the point. The goal is simpler than that, and deeper at the same time. Over 30 days, the goal is to build a different relationship with the sentence. Instead of being ruled by it, you start noticing it. Instead of obeying it automatically, you pause. Instead of treating the thought like a law, you begin treating it like a signal that can be read, a signal that can be understood, a signal that doesn't have to decide your next move. The first week isn't about changing behavior, it's about perception. Jackson begins by simply noticing. No judgment, no intervention. He doesn't try to fix anything. He just starts observing when the rejection reader shows up, in what situations, with which people, and where it appears in his body first, because it always shows up in the body before it becomes a clear thought. Sometimes it's the chest, sometimes it's the throat, tightening just a little. Sometimes it's a small shift in breathing, almost too subtle to notice, like the body preparing for something that hasn't even happened yet. Noticing the body matters because the body doesn't lie the way the mind does. The mind rationalizes. The body records. Jackson begins to notice, I'm in the body of fear right now. He doesn't analyze it. He doesn't solve it. He just names it internally. That alone is work. That alone is the witness gaining a millimeter of space. During the first few days, he realizes something surprising. The rejection reader shows up far more often than he thought. Not just in big moments, in small ones too. Standing in line at Whole Foods when the cashier seems a little impatient, rewriting a text message 3 times before sending it, opening his mouth to speak and closing it again without a sound. Seeing the frequency isn't frightening. It's informative, and information is power, not the power to control everything, but the power of awareness. In the second week, a new step appears. Once Jackson notices that the rejection reader is active, he asks a simple question. What is the real fear here? Not the surface fear, the one underneath. The surface says, I shouldn't say this, it might come out wrong. Underneath it is something else. If it comes out wrong, I'll seem smaller. And if I seem smaller, I might lose approval. And if I lose approval, that's the thread. This tracing doesn't need to be long. Sometimes it's just a sentence. Sometimes it's a quick image, a memory of an old scene, a familiar feeling of not being enough in a moment when you needed to be. The real fear is almost always old. It almost always belongs more to a younger version of Jackson, 10, 12, 15 years old, than to the present moment. That doesn't make the fear invalid, but it changes its nature. An old fear being triggered by a present moment isn't the same thing as an accurate reading of reality. It's an echo, and echoes can be recognized without being obeyed. In the third week, a third step appears. Acting without obeying the alarm, not always, not everywhere, and not in dramatic ways. Small steps are what change things. Jackson doesn't need to open up to Sarah about every insecurity he's ever had. He doesn't need to dominate Monday's meeting with a long speech. He doesn't need to call Tyler and Chris and suddenly have the deepest conversation of their friendship. He needs something smaller. Maybe when Sarah asks how he is, he says, my head's a little heavy today, instead of, I'm good. Maybe in the meeting he asks the question he almost kept to himself, just the question, not the whole speech. Maybe he sends Chris a message that isn't a joke, something small, something real, a tiny act of presence where there used to be automatic adjustment, and then something important happens afterward. Not to prove that he was safe, that's not the goal, but to slowly gather evidence that the world doesn't collapse when you show up a little more honestly than usual. Sometimes the evidence shows that things were safe. Sometimes the moment doesn't go exactly how he hoped, and still he survives it. That's survival, felt in the body, teaches something that no rational argument can teach. In the fourth week, there isn't a new instruction. There's continuation. Jackson will still regress sometime. There will be days when the rejection reader runs at full speed and the witness doesn't arrive in time. There will be nights when he lies in bed feeling like he's back at the beginning. He'll wonder if anything really changed. But if he looks honestly at the whole month, not just today, he'll notice something. He'll notice that he catches it faster, that the pause before the automatic adjustment exists now, even if it's brief. That there were moments, a few but real, when he chose differently. Moments when he stayed a little more present than usual. Moments when he said something true instead of something safe. Those moments aren't dramatic, but they're his, and they don't disappear. They stay, they accumulate, they begin forming an internal memory of what's possible, that the rejection reader can be present and he can still act, that the thought can appear and he can treat it as a signal, not a sentence, that the relationship with his own mind can be different, not perfect, not solved, different and different, built day by day through small steps and honest repetition, is everything this practice promises. It's a normal Thursday. Jackson leaves work around 6. He stops by CVS to grab something, sits in the car for a moment before starting the engine, and that's when he sees the message. It's from the group chat. Tyler is organizing a dinner next week. Just asking everyone to confirm if they're coming. Simple, ordinary. The kind of message most people answer in 10 seconds. Jackson stares at it for almost 2 minutes, because along with the message, something else arrived. A feeling, a slight tightening tightening in his chest, a thought that didn't fully form, more like fog, a hesitation without a clear name. But if he pays attention, the fog has content. Everyone's going to be comfortable with each other. I'll spend the whole night trying to fit in. The rejection reader is already reading the dinner before it even happens, already anticipating the discomfort, already calculating the cost of showing up. Jackson could send an emoji. He could say, maybe. He could buy himself time. But this time he pauses, not for long, maybe 30 seconds, just long enough to grab the small notebook he's been carrying the past few weeks. He writes 3 quick lines, fast, no effort to make it neat, just to see things clearly. Line 1. The exact thought, I'm going to feel like the outsider all night. Line 2, the fear underneath it. If I'm not constantly trying, I might not be enough to belong there. Line 3, the smallest concrete action. Confirm, show up, don't plan how to behave. That's it. Jackson doesn't solve the fear. He doesn't convince himself the dinner will be great. He doesn't give himself a motivational speech. He simply confirms, puts the phone in his pocket, starts the car, and as he pulls out of the CVS parking lot, he notices something. The pressure in his chest has softened, not gone, just lighter, because he saw the thought, named the fear, and chose an action that wasn't dictated by the alarm. That's the practice. Not in a meditation room, not in a therapy office, in a CVS parking lot on an ordinary Thursday a little after 6 in the evening. That's where the real work happens. Jackson will still have days when the rejection reader gets there first. Days when the sentence appears before he even notices it, and by the time he becomes aware of it, he's already adjusted, already edited himself, already chosen silence, before realizing there was a choice. That will keep happening. Not as failure, as part of the process, because this work doesn't have a finish line, it has a direction, and the direction is this. Every time you notice the thought before you obey it, you're doing something different from what you've done your whole life. You're creating a tiny space between the alarm and the response, and inside that space, as small as it is, there's a version of you that gets to choose, not a version without fear, a version that feels the fear, and chooses anyway. That's not a small thing, it's actually everything. What you carry today, this constant awareness of what others might think, this habit of editing yourself, this strange feeling of being close to people and still somehow distant, none of that appeared because something is wrong with you. It appeared because at some point in your life, showing too much hurt. So a younger part of you, smart, sensitive, paying attention, built a system to make sure it wouldn't hurt like that again. That system was generous. It was protective. It was necessary. But you're not 10 years old anymore. And the people in your life today, the real ones, the ones who are actually there, deserve the chance to know you. Not the edited version, not the safest version. You, the shadow, has a name, and once something has a name, it begins to lose some of its power. The rejection reader was built to protect you from an old pain, but you no longer have to be ruled by it in order to be safe. You can hear it, recognize it, and still choose to show up. One step, one moment, one honest sentence where there used to be silence. That's how it begins. And if you made it this far, some part of this story probably belongs to you too. It doesn't have to look exactly like Jackson's. Maybe it's quieter. Maybe it shows up in different places. Maybe it wears a different face. But if you recognized something in the automatic adjustment, in the sentence you almost said but didn't, in that feeling of being present and still holding yourself back, then you're already one step ahead of where you were before you started this video. And that matters more than it seems. Thank you for staying here with me. If this resonated with you, stay around. There's more.